Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The sun was one of those heavy August suns, the kind that sinks into your skin like syrup, making the backyard shimmer a little around the edges, and if you squinted just right, it looked almost magical. Balloons floated lazily in the sticky air, tied to fence posts and lawn chairs, and a long table sagged slightly under the weight of homemade casseroles, potato salads, and sweet tea sweating in glass jugs. People I loved, and people I barely tolerated, wandered around, balancing paper plates and clutching cold drinks, and honestly, for a little while, it felt like everything was exactly the way it should be. I was 32 weeks pregnant, big as a house, but somehow still glowing, or at least that's what everyone kept telling me between slaps on the back and belly rubs I had not exactly invited. Tyler, my husband, moved through the crowd like a ship through water, smiling and thanking everyone who came, kissing the tops of old ladies' heads and clinking beer bottles with his college buddies who never really grew up. From across the yard, he shot me a look, one of those silent check-ins that married people learn to read without words, and I smiled back because honestly, I thought we had made it. We had survived months of weird cravings, hormonal meltdowns, endless nursery decorating, baby name debates that got so heated we actually considered flipping a coin, and now here we were, celebrating with all the people who were supposed to have our backs. It was supposed to be a victory lap. It was supposed to be easy. I should have known better. Because standing off to the side, wearing a pastel blue blouse that matched the decorations almost too perfectly, was my mother-in-law, Deborah, and if you have ever been around a woman who can smile like a pageant queen while sharpening her knives behind her back, you know exactly what kind of afternoon I was about to have. Deborah had been a thorn in my side since the beginning, the kind of woman who could say something absolutely insulting and make it sound like a compliment if you weren't paying close attention. "Oh, Jessie, you're carrying so low." "I'm sure it's just the way your hips are shaped," she'd chirp, her voice dripping honey, but her eyes cold as stone. "Don't worry, dear, not everyone bounces back after having babies. Some women just, well, stay round." So when she grabbed the microphone we had set up for silly games and toasts, my stomach twisted harder than the baby kicking my ribs. She wasn't on the schedule. She wasn't supposed to say anything beyond the polite thank yous we had rehearsed. At first, it was normal enough. She talked about family, about traditions, about how Tyler was such a good boy and how she was so proud he was finally starting his own little family. Her tone dripped with condescension, as if Tyler had been some lost lamb until I waddled into his life and threw a lasso around his neck. People chuckled politely, the way you do when you're trapped in a situation and can't quite figure out if you should laugh or hide. But then, Deborah's smile stretched a little too wide, and she leaned closer to the microphone. She glanced at Tyler and then at me, that same cold amusement flickering behind her perfectly mascaraed lashes. "And one last thing," she said, her voice all sugar and ice. "Tyler and I talked it over, and we've decided that we'll be keeping all these lovely gifts at our house for now. After all, Jessie doesn't really need them yet, not until the baby actually arrives." There was a beat of stunned silence so thick you could have sliced it with a butter knife. Somewhere near the punch bowl, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered, sharp and sudden. A few awkward laughs floated up, the kind of laughter people make when they think maybe, just maybe, it's all a joke and they won't have to confront the ugliness that just stumbled out into the sunlight. I stood there, blinking, trying to process what she had just said. Was this happening? Was this some weird old-school tradition I hadn't been warned about, where the grandparents hoarded baby shower gifts like dragons sitting on piles of gold? But no, the look in her eyes said it all. This was personal. This was a move, a power play, and it was aimed squarely at me. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Part of me wanted to scream, to storm across the lawn and rip that microphone out of her hand. Another part, the bigger part, the smarter part, knew that if I made a scene, Deborah would win. She wanted me to explode. She wanted me to look unhinged. Before I could do anything, Tyler moved. Calm, deliberate, he walked up to Deborah, one hand tucked into his khaki shorts like he had all the time in the world. There was a slight smirk on his face, not a cruel one, not quite, more like a man who knew a secret that was about to blow the whole damn game wide open. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a slim white envelope, crisp and neatly folded, and held it out to Deborah with a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We thought you might try that," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, low and steady. Deborah's hand hesitated for half a second, just long enough for me to see her mask slip, just long enough to see a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even fear. She took the envelope like it might bite her. The yard had gone deathly quiet. No one was pretending to mingle anymore. All eyes were on her. As she slid her manicured finger under the flap and pulled out the letter inside, a strange feeling swept over me, part rage, part triumph, part sadness that it had even come to this. I watched her face closely, every micro-expression, every twitch of the muscles around her mouth. She read the first line. And then she turned absolutely, horrifyingly, gloriously pale. Something big had just cracked open under the surface of my carefully planned life, and as much as I wanted to believe that things could go back to normal, I knew deep down there was no going back after this. Not after what Tyler had just put into her hands. Tyler's smirk was the kind that people talk about for years afterward, the kind you could feel across the backyard, sharp as broken glass and just as dangerous if you got too close without paying attention. He didn't rush, didn't break stride, didn't even seem angry, which somehow made it all 100 times worse, because real fury is loud but real power is quiet, and right then Tyler was the quietest man alive. He moved through the stunned crowd like a blade through butter, slicing a straight line toward Deborah, who stood frozen, still clutching the microphone like a lifeline that was slipping right through her manicured fingers. The envelope looked so simple in his hand, thin and white and almost unimportant, but the way Deborah's face twitched when she saw it told everyone in the backyard that whatever was inside was anything but harmless. Tyler held it out to her, calm as anything, and when she hesitated, a pause so brief only the people who really knew her would notice, he smiled a little wider, as if daring her to pretend she did not know exactly what he was giving her. "We thought you might try that," he said, and his voice carried, not loud but perfectly clear, slicing through the heavy summer air and landing like a punch against Deborah's perfect facade. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the buzz of a stubborn fly circling the barbecue table and the soft clink of ice melting in abandoned drinks. Somewhere, a kid dropped a plastic cup, but even he seemed to know better than to cry. And now, just for a second, let's slow this all down, because if you were standing there, like me, belly huge, heart pounding in your throat, sweaty hands gripping the edge of your plastic chair, you might be asking yourself the same question I was asking. What would you do if a family member tried to hijack your baby shower? Would you stay calm and outsmart them, or would you blow up right there and damn the consequences? Tell me below, because God knows I was seconds away from both. Deborah's fingers trembled slightly as she took the envelope, her nails clicking against the paper in the kind of tiny, betraying sound that told everyone who was really paying attention that she was rattled. She slipped one long, bejeweled nail under the flap and pulled out the letter inside, unfolding it slowly, like every crease was a trap that might snap shut on her hand. I watched her eyes skim the page once, then again, her pupils shrinking, her face draining of color until she looked less like a proud grandmother-to-be and more like a ghost who had just realized she was already dead. The microphone sagged in her hand, lowering almost to her waist, and for a second I thought she might actually crumple right there on the patio bricks, her knees buckling under the sudden weight of what she was reading. A murmur went through the guests, low, uncomfortable, confused, because there's something about watching a person's mask rip right off their face in real time that makes even the nosiest, gossip-hungry people a little queasy. Deborah didn't say a word. Not yet. She folded the letter very carefully, with the kind of trembling, mechanical precision that made it clear she was trying like hell to buy herself a few more seconds before she had to react, before she had to face the fact that whatever game she thought she was playing, Tyler had just beaten her at it without even breaking a sweat. It would have been almost sad if it hadn't been so damn satisfying. As she stood there, pale and stunned, I felt the strange, slow click of memories slotting into place, one after another, like dominoes falling inside my head. Because the truth was, Tyler and I had seen this coming. Maybe not this exact moment, maybe not this exact humiliation in front of half the town, but we had known from the very beginning that Deborah would not be able to resist one last, desperate grab for control. It had started small, like these things always do. When we announced the pregnancy, she had congratulated us in front of everyone, but then cornered Tyler in the kitchen later to jokingly ask if we were sure we could afford a baby. When we bought our first crib, she offered to store it at her house because our apartment might get too cluttered. When we picked names, she suggested her own at every opportunity, like a broken record stuck on the same selfish tune. Every boundary we tried to set, she pushed. Every decision we made, she second-guessed. And when Tyler finally told her, very firmly, very clearly, that we were handling things our way, she smiled that same pageant smile and said she understood, and then immediately began plotting how to get around us. So, a few weeks before the shower, after a particularly nasty phone call where she tried to insist she approve our guest list, Tyler had sat me down on the living room couch, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "I think we need a backup plan." That backup plan was the letter. Tyler had talked to a lawyer, a friend of his from college who owed him a favor, and had drafted a simple but brutal document, a legal notice stating that all gifts received at the shower were pre-designated property of our unborn child's trust, not our personal property, and that any unauthorized attempt to remove, store, or control those gifts without our consent would be considered theft, prosecutable under local law. It was clever, nasty, airtight, and exactly the kind of quiet revenge that Tyler specialized in when someone pushed him just a little too far. Standing there now, watching Deborah fight to keep her breathing even, to keep her hands from visibly shaking, I felt the weight of all those months of slow, grinding battles lifting off my shoulders. Maybe it wasn't the big, dramatic showdown I had fantasized about in my darker moments, no screaming, no plates thrown, no red-faced shouting matches, but it was better. Because Deborah wasn't just losing. She was losing without even the dignity of a fight. And as Tyler turned away from her calmly, slowly, the picture of a man who had just done what needed doing, I realized that whatever happened next, whatever new schemes she tried to hatch, the balance of power had just shifted forever. She knew it. Tyler knew it. And so did I. It's funny how you can look back at a situation and see every warning sign flashing like a goddamn lighthouse, but when you are living it, buried in it day after day, those signs feel more like background noise you can almost ignore if you squint hard enough and lie to yourself just a little longer. I used to tell myself that Deborah's behavior was just excitement, that her constant meddling and nitpicking came from love, not control, because it was easier to believe that than admit I was walking straight into a war I didn't want to fight. The first real crack had come when we announced we were pregnant, standing in the middle of a crowded Olive Garden of all places, with breadsticks going stale on the table and a waitress hovering awkwardly while we told them. Frank, my father-in-law, had grinned and clapped Tyler on the back like he had just won the damn Super Bowl, but Deborah had just tilted her head and given me this odd little smile, tight-lipped and chilly, like I had just confessed to stealing her best jewelry instead of giving her a grandchild. Later that night, when Tyler went outside with Frank to poke around the grill like men do when they need to avoid awkward emotions, Deborah cornered me in the kitchen, her voice syrupy and low. "You'll be naming her after me, of course," she said, not asked, just stated like it was already decided, already written into law. Deborah is a strong name. It carries weight. Prestige. I laughed, thinking she was joking, and when I realized she wasn't, The laughter dried up in my throat like a dead leaf. I tried to explain, gently at first, that Tyler and I had already talked about names, that we wanted something fresh, something just ours. Deborah had smiled, that same brittle, plastic smile, and said, "Oh, you'll change your mind once you see how much easier it'll make things for everyone." At the time, I brushed it off. First time mom nerves, I told myself. Hormones. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But it wasn't just the name. It was the nursery. When Tyler and I excitedly posted a picture of the nursery paint swatches we were choosing between, soft greens and warm yellows, nothing too loud, Deborah commented within minutes. "Too bland," she wrote. "Baby needs bold colors to stimulate their brain." And the next day, a giant box arrived at our door, full of garish, bright furniture she had picked out herself, without asking, without even pretending to care what we wanted. There were other things, too, small things almost invisible on their own, but each one chipping away at my sense of control, my sense of safety in my own damn life. When I mentioned wanting to use cloth diapers, she sent us 3 giant boxes of disposables with a note saying, "New moms don't know what's practical." When I said I wanted to breastfeed, she started collecting formula samples just in case, piling them up like silent accusations in the corner of our kitchen. Every decision I made was second-guessed, undermined, overridden if she could manage it. And every single time, Tyler would say, "She means well, Jessie," and I would bite my tongue until it bled because fighting about it felt like admitting it was worse than I wanted to believe. There's this invisible pressure that settles over you when you marry into a family, especially one that seems so tightly wound, so desperate to maintain appearances, and at first, I let it win. I smiled through gritted teeth. I said thank you for things I didn't want. I let her rub my pregnant belly without asking, let her make plans for a baby shower I hadn't even agreed to yet, let her talk about when the baby stays at our house like it was a foregone conclusion and not a conversation we hadn't even started having. I told myself over and over again that being a good daughter-in-law meant compromise, meant patience, meant letting go of little things because the big picture, family, connection, unity, was supposed to matter more. But little things add up. One dropped grain of sand doesn't seem like much until you realize you're standing at the bottom of a landslide. The final straw before the shower, though I didn't recognize it as final at the time, came during a doctor's appointment that Deborah somehow accidentally found out about and coincidentally decided to attend without an invitation. She showed up in the waiting room, purse slung over her arm like she owned the place, and proceeded to interrogate my OB-GYN about our birth plan as if she were the one giving birth instead of me. That night, sitting on the edge of our bed, one hand cradling my belly, the other gripping a pillow tight enough to tear the seams, I asked Tyler, "How long do we let her do this?" He had stared at the ceiling for a long time, the kind of long silence that says more than 1,000 words ever could, and finally, he said, "Not much longer." That was when we started preparing. Not for a conversation, not for a heart-to-heart, not for some cheesy Lifetime movie-style breakthrough where the stubborn mother-in-law tearfully apologizes and everyone hugs it out over coffee cake. No, we prepared for battle. Quietly, carefully, like 2 soldiers setting traps along a forest trail, we began making plans, setting boundaries in writing, talking to the right people, making sure that when the time came, and we knew it would come, we would not just be ready to react. We would be ready to win. The baby shower had just become the battleground, but the war had been brewing for a long, long time. And as I stood there now, watching Deborah's face drain of color with that letter trembling in her hand, I knew we had played it exactly right. Because love without respect is just control dressed up pretty, and I had finally stopped confusing the two. There is a strange kind of peace that settles over you when you stop hoping for someone to change and start planning for how you are going to protect yourself when they don't. It is not bitter, not at first, and it does not come with any fireworks or grand speeches. It is quiet, methodical, like the soft click of a deadbolt locking at night when you know damn well no one else is going to keep you safe but yourself. That was the place Tyler and I found ourselves standing in about 6 weeks before the baby shower, somewhere between heartbreak and grim acceptance, and it was there, in that strange middle ground, that the plan was born. It started one evening when I was sitting cross-legged on the couch, shoving a pile of onesies into a drawer we had repurposed as temporary baby storage, and Tyler was pacing slow circles around the living room like a tiger in a too-small cage. We had just gotten off the phone with Deborah, who had spent 30 solid minutes explaining how she had accidentally sent out her own version of the baby shower invitations, the ones that directed guests to send gifts directly to her house for safekeeping. She had not even asked us if it was okay, had not even thought about whether it might upset us, because deep down she did not give a damn. I remember Tyler setting his beer down so hard the foam foamed out the top and down the side, his mouth tight, his jaw working like he was trying to chew through something too tough to swallow. "We have to be ready," he said finally, voice low and dangerous in a way I had only ever heard once or twice before, and every time I had heard it, something big had broken right after. "I don't know what she's planning exactly, but she's planning something." We could have confronted her right then and there, could have screamed and shouted and thrown ultimatums around like grenades, but both of us knew how that would end. A spectacular family implosion that would leave us looking like the unreasonable ones, the unstable ones, while Deborah wept about how ungrateful we were for her help. No, if we wanted to survive this, we had to be smarter than that. Tyler made a call to his old college roommate, Mark, a guy who had gone from drunkenly stealing traffic cones at frat parties to becoming a damn good lawyer who specialized in family law and estate planning. It was Mark who came up with the idea of the letter, simple and brilliant, and just aggressive enough to send a clear message, without opening us up to more trouble. The letter, the one that would later shake Deborah down to her designer heels, was worded perfectly, almost politely on the surface, but underneath, every line carried the weight of potential lawsuits and financial consequences. It formally stated that every item gifted at the baby shower was to be considered the legal property of a trust established for the benefit of our unborn child, effective immediately upon receipt. The trust was registered, documented, and real, a neat little wall we had built around our baby with legal mortar no amount of guilt trips or passive aggression could break down. If anyone, including but not limited to family members, attempted to remove, redirect, sell, or otherwise interfere with the gifts without express written permission from both Tyler and me, they would be subject to immediate civil action. It was all couched in stiff legalese, the kind of language that makes even the most arrogant person think twice, and the best part was it was ironclad. We printed 3 copies, had them notarized, sealed them away, and agreed we would only use them if absolutely necessary. Part of me hoped it would never come to that maybe Deborah would sense somehow, deep in whatever twisted part of her still cared about Tyler, that this time she had pushed too far and she would back off. But another, quieter part of me, the part that had learned, over too many humiliations and compromises, that hope is a dangerous drug, knew better. In the weeks leading up to the shower, we dropped tiny, deliberate hints, like breadcrumbs laid carefully in the dark. Tyler mentioned, casually over Sunday dinner, that we had gotten some great legal advice about how to protect ourselves as new parents. I left a copy of a book called Family Boundaries and Legal Safeguards lying face up on the coffee table when Deborah came by to drop off another unsolicited pile of nursery decorations. We made sure she knew, without ever saying it directly, that we were not as naive as she thought we were. Still, we kept the letter itself a secret, because a weapon only works if your enemy doesn't know it's coming until it's too late to dodge. The suspense built like a storm cloud, stacking itself higher and heavier with each passing day, and sometimes late at night, when the house was dark and the only sounds were the soft hum of the fridge and Tyler's even breathing beside me, I would lie there wide-eyed and wonder, would she really be that bold? Would she really try to hijack something as sacred as a baby shower, something that was supposed to be about love and hope and family? I didn't have to wonder long. Because the thing about people like Deborah is, they cannot help themselves. They do not believe in consequences. Not really. They believe in manipulation, in leverage, in wearing you down until you give up just to get a little peace. But this time we were ready. This time we had drawn a line so deep even she would have to trip over it. And as the day of the baby shower dawned, with the sky that blinding, hopeful blue that feels like a promise you are almost afraid to believe in, Tyler tucked the letter into the back pocket of his jeans, kissed my forehead, and said, "Let's go have some fun." And I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever Deborah was about to try, it would not end the way she thought it would. Deborah stood there in the middle of our backyard, the afternoon sun beating down hard enough to make even the brightest decorations start to look a little washed out. The envelope hanging limp in her trembling hand, like she no longer had the strength or the will to hold onto it. For a long, breathless moment, she did not move, did not speak, did not even seem to breathe, and if you had walked in at that exact second, you would have thought the party had been frozen in time. Every guest caught mid-sip, mid-laugh, mid-step, locked into an uncomfortable tableau they would not soon forget. The letter had not exploded, had not screamed accusations or threats in red ink, but it had done something far more devastating. It had stripped Deborah bare right there in front of everyone she had hoped to impress. It had shown her that her usual games of manipulation and control were not just exposed, but officially out of bounds now, and that if she so much as lifted one of those baby gifts from the table, she would be setting herself up for a legal battle she could not possibly win. Her eyes skimmed the page again, desperate to find a loophole, a misunderstanding, some small technicality she could use to twist her way free, but it was not there, because Tyler and I had made damn sure it was not there. Every word had been chosen carefully, surgically, with the kind of precision that only comes from weeks of preparation and years of swallowing your anger until you finally have the tools to spit it back out in a way that counts. When Deborah finally looked up, her face was a ghastly shade of gray, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to say something, anything, but no words came out. She swayed slightly on her heels, the microphone dangling from one hand and the letter from the other, and for a half-second I honestly thought she might faint right there onto the manicured lawn. The same way she had once pretended to be lightheaded when Tyler refused to attend a charity gala she insisted was critical to their family image. Tyler let the silence stretch, let it grow so wide and heavy that it filled every corner of the backyard, pressing down on the guests who had gathered in neat little clusters. Their heads swinging back and forth like spectators at a tennis match they had not paid to see but could not tear themselves away from now. Finally, with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing you have already won, Tyler stepped forward, took the microphone from Deborah's slack fingers, and turned to face the crowd. His voice was steady, warm even, but underneath it there was steel, a quiet warning that cut sharper than any scream. "I just want to thank everyone for coming today," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd with a confidence I had never admired more than in that moment. "We're so grateful for the love and support you've all shown as we get ready to welcome our little one." There was a nervous ripple of polite claps, the sound hollow and brittle against the weight of the tension hanging over us. "I know there's been a little confusion," Tyler continued, his smile thin but polite, "about the gifts and where they're going. Jesse and I decided, after a lot of discussion and advice, to set up a trust for our baby. Every gift you brought today, every stroller, every blanket, every box of diapers now belongs legally to that trust. Not to me, not to Jesse, not to anyone else." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting every guest feel the gravity of what he had just said. Across the yard, a woman I vaguely recognized from Tyler's side of the family put a hand over her mouth, while another guest, one of my coworkers, shifted awkwardly on his feet like he wanted very badly to disappear. "This was done to protect our child's future," Tyler said, his voice never rising, never trembling, and to make sure that every generous gift you chose to bring today goes exactly where you intended it to go, to our baby. He did not mention Deborah by name, did not call her out directly, but every single person standing there knew exactly who and what he was talking about. And the air crackled with the kind of unspoken understanding that makes it impossible to pretend you didn't see what you just saw. From where I stood, half hidden behind a table stacked with pink and blue cupcakes, I could see the storm brewing in Deborah's eyes, the desperate flicker of someone realizing she had miscalculated badly. The helpless fury of a woman who was used to playing chess against children suddenly finding herself checkmated by a grown man who had seen all her moves coming from a mile away. A few of the guests began to gather their things quietly, murmuring excuses about early dinners and long drives, their faces carefully neutral but their eyes wide with shock. One by one, they drifted away from the tables, from the tension, from the wreckage of a family dynamic that had finally, publicly imploded. Deborah stood rooted to the spot, abandoned for the moment by the social army she had always counted on to back her up, her hands still trembling so badly she had to shove the letter into her purse just to hide it. As Tyler handed the microphone back to the DJ and walked toward me, his face calm but his eyes burning with an intensity that made my heart ache, I realized that this moment, this perfect, brutal unraveling, was not just about protecting our baby's gifts. It was about drawing a line in the sand, about standing up and saying, without apology or compromise, that we would not be bullied, would not be guilt, would not be controlled by people who thought love was a weapon to be wielded instead of a bridge to be built. And as Tyler reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine with a quiet strength that said louder than any speech that we were in this together, I squeezed back and held on tight. Because in that moment, standing amid the remains of what was supposed to be a celebration, I understood something I had always been too afraid to admit to myself. Sometimes you have to burn the whole damn thing down to build something worth living in. And Deborah, for all her scheming, had just handed us the match. It would have been so much easier if it had just been selfishness, if it had just been another case of Deborah being Deborah, poking and prodding and pushing her way into corners of our life where she did not belong, all for the sake of appearances or control or some twisted idea of what it meant to be a mother. I could have wrapped my head around that, maybe even found a way to forgive it eventually, after enough time had passed and enough boundaries had been rebuilt stronger and higher than before. But the truth, as it so often does, turned out to be much uglier, and once it started to unravel, once the pieces began clicking into place with sickening clarity, I realized that we had not just been dealing with manipulation or passive aggression or the garden variety craziness that sometimes blooms in families under the strain of big life changes. We had been dealing with a plan, a real, calculated, cold-blooded plan, and for the first time since all of this began, I understood that Deborah had never been playing checkers against us. She had been playing poker, and she had been betting far more than any of us realized. It started with a conversation I overheard purely by accident, about a week after the shower, when Tyler and I were dropping off some baby supplies at his parents' house, a gesture Tyler insisted on out of sheer stubborn politeness, still trying to keep up the facade that things were salvageable even when we both knew better deep down. Frank had not heard me come in. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his voice low and hoarse as he talked on the phone, but his words carried clearly enough through the half-open window. "We're good for it," he was saying, his tone desperate in a way I had never heard before, not even when he got drunk at Christmas and cried about old football injuries. "Just a few more months. I told you, the house is worth more than enough. We'll get the money, one way or another." Something cold slid down my spine, and without meaning to, I stepped back onto the porch, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. Later, after we had loaded the car and waved our stiff goodbyes, I told Tyler what I had heard, and he just sat there behind the steering wheel for a long, long time, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the wheel like he was afraid of what would come out if he let go. Slowly, painfully, pieces began to click into place, pieces that had been right there in front of us the whole time, but that we had not wanted to see. The way Deborah had pushed so hard for Tyler to invest in their renovation projects, the ones that never seemed to move past the planning stage. The way Frank had suddenly taken early retirement from a job he had sworn he loved, citing health reasons, even though he looked just as fit as ever. The way Deborah had started selling off heirlooms and antiques she had once sworn she would pass down to her grandchildren, all while insisting it was time for a fresh start. And suddenly it made perfect, horrifying sense why she had tried to redirect the gifts, why she had tried to claim them before we could even open half of them, because to her, they were not sentimental offerings from friends and family, not heartfelt gestures of love for the life growing inside me. They were assets. Liquid, untraceable, easily pawned or resold if necessary. Deborah had not been thinking about bassinets or diaper genies or tiny onesies embroidered with teddy bears. She had been thinking about cash. About how to prop up the crumbling castle she and Frank had built out of lies and bad bets and a desperate need to maintain the illusion that everything was fine, that they were still the golden couple they had been in high school. The realization hit me so hard I almost could not breathe. This was not just about boundary pushing or family drama anymore. This was theft, premeditated and deliberate, dressed up in the polite language of concern and family tradition. And worse, much worse, they had tried to use our child, our unborn, innocent child, as a tool to dig themselves out of a hole they had spent years digging. For a few minutes, I just sat there in the car with Tyler, staring at the dashboard, feeling like the ground under my feet had shifted and cracked without warning. I thought about the ultrasound picture tucked into my wallet, the tiny perfect outline of a life we had worked so hard to protect, to nurture, to love before it even had a name. I thought about every late night spent picking out cribs and bottles and rocking chairs, every anxious trip to the doctor, every whispered conversation in the dark about how scared and excited we were to become parents. And now, layered over all of that, was the ugly knowledge that for some people, even people who should have loved our child more than anything, those dreams and hopes were just chips on a table, things to be traded and leveraged and sold if it meant buying themselves a little more time, a little more comfort. Tyler broke the silence first, his voice rough but steady. "We're done," he said simply, and though the words were quiet, they cracked something open inside me, something raw and necessary. We were done pretending. Done hoping they would change. Done offering chances they had no intention of ever taking. We were not just protecting ourselves anymore. We were protecting our family, our real family, the one we were building with every beat of our hearts and every breath we took. And for the first time since that damn baby shower, I felt something that tasted almost like peace. Because now, at least, we knew the truth. And once you know the truth, you can never, ever go back to pretending it is anything else. The thing no one tells you about family implosions is how loud they are at first, and how deafening the silence becomes afterward, like standing in the middle of a fireworks show only to find yourself alone in the smoke once the last rocket fades. The fallout from the baby shower was not the dramatic, one-time explosion I might have imagined once upon a time. It was slower, uglier, and far more public than anything I could have prepared myself for. Like watching a dam break in slow motion while you stand helpless on the wrong side of it. At first, the backyard just buzzed with low, uncomfortable murmurs, clusters of guests whispering behind plastic cups of lukewarm punch, stealing glances at Tyler, at Deborah, at me. Like they were trying to figure out which side they were supposed to be standing on and what would happen if they chose wrong. You could practically feel the calculation happening behind their smiles, like some twisted social chess game where every move could cost you an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner or a spot in the family photo next year. Frank, who had been suspiciously quiet through most of Deborah's little spectacle, suddenly came alive like someone had flipped a switch deep inside him, and he stormed across the lawn toward Tyler with a look on his face that was somewhere between fury and disbelief. His voice cracked like a whip in the heavy air, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How dare you humiliate your mother like this?" He bellowed, jabbing a finger into Tyler's chest, A ridiculous gesture considering Tyler stood nearly a full head taller and could have crushed him if he so much as breathed too hard. After everything she's done for you, after everything we've sacrificed, this is how you repay us? Tyler did not move, did not blink, just stood there with that same calm, dangerous look on his face that had made Deborah wilt only minutes earlier. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried easily across the tense backyard. Everything you've done, he said evenly, you did for yourselves. Not for me. And sure as hell not for my family. Frank sputtered, searching for words, his face going an alarming shade of red that clashed horribly with his pastel polo shirt. For a moment, I thought he might actually swing at his own son, but before he could take it that far, Rachel, my best friend, my sister in everything but blood, cut through the growing chaos like a hot knife. You're a damn leech in pearls, Deborah, Rachel said, her voice slicing through the muttering like a gunshot, every word crisp and merciless. You're standing there crying about being humiliated when you tried to rob your own grandchild's future to patch up whatever mess you and Frank made for yourselves. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a shockwave, and I caught more than one person stepping instinctively back from Deborah, like they might catch something contagious just by standing too close. Deborah's face twisted, a grotesque mask of outrage and wounded pride, and for a second it looked like she might launch herself at Rachel, which would have been a hell of a thing to see, honestly, but then something in her seemed to crack for real. She let out a sharp, guttural sound that was half sob, half scream, and turned on her heel, storming toward the house with her heels sinking into the soft grass, dragging Frank behind her like a broken toy. He threw one last venomous look over his shoulder at Tyler before stumbling after her, leaving behind a backyard full of uncomfortable silence, half-eaten cake, and guests too stunned or too cowardly to do anything but stare. The weight of it all hit me then, like a punch to the gut I never saw coming, and I sank into one of the cheap folding chairs, my hands resting protectively over the curve of my belly, trying to breathe through the cocktail of anger, sadness, relief, and deep, soul-wrenching grief that swirled inside me. Because even though I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Tyler and I had done the right thing, that protecting our baby from whatever selfish madness had infected his parents was not just necessary, but absolutely vital. It still hurt in ways I could not name. This was not how family was supposed to be. This was not how celebrations were supposed to end. Around me, the crowd slowly began to thin, people mumbling half-hearted goodbyes and awkward excuses, unable or unwilling to look me in the eye for more than a second. Only a few stayed, Rachel, of course, her arms crossed defiantly like she was daring anyone to say something about her outburst, and a couple of old friends who knew enough about real loyalty to stay standing even when the easy thing would have been to slip away unnoticed. Tyler sat down beside me, the plastic chair creaking under his weight, and for a long minute we just sat there in the heavy, buzzing silence, watching the late afternoon sun sink lower behind the fence, casting long shadows over the wreckage of what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of our lives. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice rough but steady, and he reached out to take my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in a small, grounding gesture. I shook my head because he had nothing to apologize for. We had done what needed to be done. We had drawn the line. We had chosen our future over their dysfunction, our baby over their pride. And sitting there, hand in hand, surrounded by the remnants of a party that had turned into a battlefield, I knew we had also chosen each other. No matter what storms would come, and I knew damn well there were more storms waiting just over the horizon, we would face them the same way we had faced this one. Together. The backyard looked like a war zone once the guests had gone, littered with half-empty paper cups, crumpled napkins, and forgotten plates, the once bright balloons sagging sadly against the fence in the heavy evening air, as if even the decorations themselves could not bear the weight of what had happened. Tyler and I sat side by side on two folding chairs near the gift table, staring out over the wreckage in silence, too tired to clean up, too wrung out to speak, too full of thoughts we could not yet find words for. The unopened presents sat in neat little piles around us, cheerful wrapping paper and glittery bows that now felt almost grotesque in their cheerfulness. Reminders of a day that had started with so much hope and ended with lines drawn so deep that neither of us knew if they could ever be crossed again. I leaned back in my chair, one hand resting on my swollen belly, the other dangling uselessly by my side, and listened to the faint hum of cicadas rising up from the woods beyond the fence, a sound so normal, so stubbornly ordinary, that it almost made me want to laugh. Tyler sat hunched forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands dangling between them, staring down at the cracked patio stones like he was trying to read some kind of answer in their worn, uneven surfaces. I knew without asking that he was replaying every second of the afternoon in his head, just like I was, picking apart every word, every look, every choice we had made, wondering if there was a different path we could have taken. A way to have stopped this train wreck before it smashed everything we thought we knew about family. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he spoke, his voice low and rough like he had been chewing the words over and over before finally forcing them out. "I don't know if we can come back from this," he said, not looking at me, his gaze still fixed on the ground like he was afraid of what he might see if he looked me in the eye. I did not answer right away because what could I say that would not just make it worse? I could feel the ache of it in my bones, the grief of it, the slow, grinding loss of people we had once loved, or at least thought we were supposed to love, and no matter how justified we were, no matter how necessary our actions had been, it still hurt like hell. "I don't want our kid growing up around that," I said finally, and my voice broke a little on the last word because saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it never could. "I don't want them growing up thinking that love is something you have to earn by sacrificing your dignity or your happiness." Tyler finally looked at me then, his eyes tired but clear, and he nodded slowly, like a man coming to the end of a long, painful road and realizing that there was no bridge waiting to carry him over to safety. Only the choice to turn back or to start building something new from the wreckage. "You know what's crazy?" he said after a moment, a bitter little laugh escaping his lips. "I found out today that Dad took a second mortgage out on their house months ago. Never told anyone. Not even Mom, from what I can tell." I sat up a little straighter, my heart lurching painfully against my ribs because somehow, even after everything, part of me had still believed that the betrayal had a limit, a boundary it would not cross. But no, the rot had gone deeper than we thought, spreading through every foundation we had trusted, poisoning even the things that should have been sacred. "So what do we do now?" I asked, the words hanging heavy between us, heavier than the thick summer air, heavier than the tired weight in my limbs, heavier than anything I had ever said before in my life. Tyler was quiet for a long time before he answered, and when he did, it was not with a plan or a promise or a neat little solution tied up with a bow. "I don't know," he said, and there was something almost freeing in hearing him say it, in admitting that sometimes there are no clean answers, no perfect paths, just the messy, painful work of choosing the lesser evil and living with the consequences. We sat there until the sun disappeared completely behind the trees and the backyard was swallowed up by shadows, the twinkle lights strung along the fence casting faint, flickering halos over the forgotten plates and crushed cups, making the wreckage look almost beautiful in a sad, broken way. I thought about what forgiveness would mean, about pretending that none of it had happened, about inviting Deborah and Frank into our home again, into our child's life, knowing what they were capable of. I thought about what cutting them off would mean, about the lonely holidays, the whispered judgment from people who would never understand why we made the choices we did, the permanent hole where family should have been. And the truth was, neither path felt right. Neither path felt fair. Because sometimes blood is not thicker than betrayal. Sometimes love is not enough to fix what has been broken so deliberately, so selfishly, so completely. And sometimes the hardest thing in the world is realizing that protecting your own peace, your own family, means walking away from people you once thought you could not live without. We did not make any final decisions that night, sitting in the wreckage of a party that had turned into a battlefield, and maybe that was for the best. Maybe some choices are too heavy to make all at once, too big to squeeze into a single moment, no matter how broken you feel standing there in the ashes. But as Tyler reached over and took my hand again, his fingers warm and steady against mine, I knew this much. Whatever choice we made, we would make it together, with clear eyes and steady hearts, not out of anger or spite, but out of the fierce, stubborn love we had for the life we were building, the future we were protecting. And as the night closed in around us, wrapping the backyard in darkness and quiet and the faint hum of distant traffic, I found myself wondering, would you forgive, or would you walk away?